Sorry I'm late.
Oh, now you decide to show up? What took you so long?
Well, I woke up late, and then I was so frazzled, I couldn't seem to get the day started. I lost my keys. I started my coffee without a filter in the coffee maker. Then I put on 2 different shoes.
Oof, sounds like you were rushing your way into bad decisions, which happens to be one of the most common timing mistakes on the LSAT.
Well, let's not waste any more time getting to this week's topic then. LSAT time management.
Welcome to The Legal Level, a podcast from LSATMax. I'm Jelena.
And I'm Branden. We're your companions on the road to the legal field, whether you've just started thinking about law school or you've already passed the bar.
What are you, a lawyer?
The Legal Level is available from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you're listening to it right now.
If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and tell a friend.
And as always, if you have questions about this episode, you can talk to a 99th percentile LSAT instructor by texting LSAT to 310-818-7743.
Or, if you'd like your question to be on the show, just email podcast@testmaxprep.com, and we might answer you on the air.
Before we get into timing, let's take a little time to talk about what's new in the world of the LSAT. First up, apparently LSAC lost some LSAT-flex answers. About 140 July test takers' responses were not saved, and they will have to retake the test.
Yikes. Well, at least LSAC seems appropriately embarrassed about this. They've already notified everyone affected and are offering them free retake opportunities, as well as a refund and 4 free law school reports.
Law school reports are not a report on a law school, by the way. They should really be called potential law student reports because they're the report on you that LSAC sends to law schools. And each one costs $45, so basically LSAC is offering an extra $180 coupon to the people whose answers were lost.
Still, bummer to have to retake unexpectedly. But that's par for the course with the LSAT. As we've said before on this podcast, assume something will go wrong with your test. Plan accordingly.
Whew, amen to that. And that is pretty much the only big headline about the LSAT this month, but as a reminder, August lsat-flex testing begins on August 29th, so get those practice reps in, August test takers. It is closer than you think.
And while this isn't an episode about the bar exam, as a BarMax instructor, I can't help mentioning some really big news from the other side of law school.
Pandemic right here!
Due to COVID-19, there's a growing movement to temporarily allow new lawyers to practice without passing the bar through a system called Diploma Privilege. In other words, if you have your JD, you get the privilege of practicing law, at least for a little while. Theoretically, this would be a temporary measure until it's safe to administer the bar exam in person again.
So why can't the bar exam be temporarily moved online like the LSAT has been?
Well, some states are planning to try a remotely proctored bar exam this October, but it's a much longer test than the LSAT, and the stakes are way higher. If you run into a technical issue on your LSAT, you retake. But if a technical issue with the proctoring software ruins your bar exam, you could lose a great job offer. And even some of the companies that provide remote proctoring software say they can't handle proctoring the bar exam for thousands of students. One company, Xtegrity, is actually refusing to provide its software for the October bar exam. They announced on August 6th that they believe remote proctoring, quote, carries undue risk for the October bar.
So, if I'm following this correctly, this has been a pretty huge drama for new law school graduates and for the NCBE, which is the National Conference of Bar Examiners, right? I mean, I'm seeing stuff on Twitter that sounds like there's basically a civil war going on.
Yeah, it's been pretty wild. We'll put some links in the show notes so listeners who aren't ready for the bar yet can get up to speed, and maybe we can cover bar news more deeply in a future episode. But the short version is, some law students, lawyers, and professors say there not only shouldn't be a bar exam during COVID-19, but there just shouldn't be a bar exam at all. As you might expect, the NCBE doesn't like that stance very much, and they even threaten to retaliate against critics of the bar exam.
Hold on. Retaliate? Like, what kind of retaliation?
Well, why don't I read you the exact quote from NCBE CEO Judith Gunderson? She said, Character and fitness issues are arising in the way examinees are communicating with board staff and board volunteers.
Whoa. So basically, she's saying she might consider overly pointed criticism of NCB and its employees or volunteers to be a character and fitness issue, like something sufficient to impede someone's ability to get a license to practice law? That sounds like a pretty major overreaction to some angry tweets.
Yeah, that seems to be pretty much how the legal community feels. But so far, the NCBE has not backed down, and they have not apologized for Judith's comments. We'll keep an eye on this story as it continues to develop.
Sounds like it might take some time for the dust to settle. And speaking of time...
Yes, let's speak of time. Specifically, time management on the LSAT, today's marquee topic.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know if you've had the same experience with this, but I feel like time management is definitely in the top 3 concerns, if not the top concern, that students have once they've learned what all the question types are, what's a logic game, what's reading comprehension, what's an LR question. Once they're actually doing full practice tests, all of a sudden I feel like students really panic about the time. Has that been your experience with your students too, Brandon?
Yeah, that is my experience. And I always tell my students that I think there's really like 2 steps in preparing for the LSAT. One is to learn how to answer questions correctly, and then the other is to learn how to do that under time pressure. And they are 2 totally different things. I found in my studies that I was someone who did not manage time very well. And I was butting up against the same score. And I know this is a fairly high score, but it was a score that I knew I could beat. When I was studying for the LSAT, I got 168 after 168 after 168. It was not like I got a 167 one time and a 169 another time. That was all I got.
Ouch.
And I knew I could do better than that, but I was not using my time intelligently. Instead, I was butting my head against questions that I was not getting right and was not going to get right the way I was doing it. And I had to adjust my take on it. And when I did that, I actually saw a very large score increase because I started managing time in a way that worked with my test-taking abilities.
So when you talk about managing time in a way that works with your test-taking abilities, I feel like that gets to one of the top 3, top 2 issues that people have with time management. There's a certain realism that you have to have in order to manage your time well on the LSAT. And that kind of starts with, at least in my opinion, realizing that the test is not designed for the average test taker to finish all of the questions with a high degree of accuracy, which is a really hard thing to wrap your head around when you're new to it, because what other test have we ever taken that is not written to be finishable in the time allowed? I mean, I cannot think of another one. Even in tough classes that have like 2 stars on Rate My Professor because the tests are too tough, other than the LSAT, I never really in my academic career, which admittedly is not the most illustrious, but I never really ran into a test that was not designed to be finishable for the average student. So the LSAT, on the other hand, that is part of the test. They know that they're throwing more at students than most people can do, at least do with a high degree of accuracy in the time allowed. So, I tell my students that there is a point where you have to say, okay, I am someone who, at my best solving speed, I solve 3 games perfectly, and I'm going to have to guess on the 4th one. And for most people, for people who need to get, a 160 score, a 164, a 165, mathematically, that's going to be way better than pushing yourself to do 4 games, but then you miss 20% of the questions in the section. Would you agree?
I agree 100%. And I think a lot of what's going on here is something that, and I mean, I think you got at it. I think it's intentional. So I think the makers of the LSAT are seeing whether or not you can strategize. And that's one of the main things that lawyers do. It's one of the things that you're tested on in law school. Maybe not in your contracts class, but in a lot of the more practical classes, they're saying, can you strategize to attack something? And so it's not just the subject matter of the exam that you're being tested on. It's how you address the exam. And what I always tell my students is, if you are just doing the questions in the order that the makers of the LSAT give them to you, then you're not strategizing and you're actually failing that part of the exam. And I'm sure we will get into it, but I have for each section, a lot of tips and recommendations about how to pick up the points that you are most likely to get before reaching for those harder points. And unless you demand a 180 on the LSAT, you're going to miss questions, and it's fine to miss questions. And it's better to just not spend any time on the questions you're not going to get right anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that goes for all of the sections. It's really an overall perspective thing. There's no other major test at least no other major test that's taken by nearly as many people as the LSAT, where you can miss as many questions as you can miss on the LSAT and still be well in the upper half of test takers. I mean, you can miss, anywhere from 10 to 13 questions and still get a 170.
What, like it's hard?
On the average LSAT, that's, 10% or more of the questions. And what other test can you miss 10% or more of the questions and still have really, truly a fantastic score?
What's amazing is you can miss 40% of the questions and still have the kind of score that will get you into some law schools. And, that's missing 40% of questions is a D-. And that is that's a low 150 score, and that can get you into certain schools. It will keep you out of a lot of schools, but it won't keep you out of every school.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that really that's the beauty of the LSAT, and failing to understand it is the trap of the LSAT, thinking that it is like pretty much every other test we've taken in our lives, a test where close to 100% of questions right is the bar to meet. That is not what this test is. This test is do your personal best using strategy and the time allowed. Now, for me, I do typically do most of the questions in the order that they're given, but I do them in such a way that I know when I'm throwing good time after bad. And if I feel that I'm throwing good time after bad, like say, if I'm low on time on LR and I run into a parallel flaw question that I can see just from the size of the stimulus that it takes up like half a page of the test, or now that we're on the digital test, that I'm having to scroll a bunch just to read the stimulus, then that's probably a question that I am going to flag to do later and move on from, even though for the majority of the section, I am going to tend to go in order. However, if I'm not in LR, if I'm in either RC or logic games, before going through in order, I do as much of the work up front as I possibly can. I do as much of the annotation of the passage, as much understanding of the passage and perspectives, and I do as much diagramming on logic games, including diagramming my scenarios. So my goal is actually to burn more of my time preparing to get the questions right than actually reading through the questions and getting them right. I call that front loading, and that to me, learning to front load effectively is the key to speed. And there is a degree of front loading that you can do on LR as well, which on LR, I call it anticipation. In other words, reading the stimulus correctly so that you know what the correct answer is before you even begin reading the answer choices. So that's really my overarching strategy for time management, is do as much of your work before you are actually solving a question or looking at answer choices as you possibly can. So you said you have a method for each section. So why don't you share with our listeners your method for each section of the test?
All right. Is everybody settled in here? This is going to take a while.
Get a snack, get your popcorn. Branden is going to soliloquy.
Yeah. So, first, kind of more broadly about all of the sections is most people who have taken a full LSAT or two will notice that on average, questions are more straightforward at the beginning of a section. They tend to get harder as the section goes, but they don't leave the hardest questions for the end. So for instance, in logical reasoning, usually where they put the real landmines is around like questions 18 through 22, something like that. And what they're hoping you will do is that you'll burn a bunch of time on those really hard questions and not get to the more straightforward questions at 23, 24, 25. And that's true of the other sections of the exam as well, which is the really nasty stuff is very often game 3 or passage 3 very often. And so, like I was talking about, I think you want to try to pick up the points that are manageable first and then go for the reach points later. So for logical reasoning, the way that I address that is, what you were talking about is front loading your work and anticipating and also bailing on stuff that is not working for you or is not going to work for you. And so what I do with my students is I usually present like a menu of questions that you might want to consider skipping. And what I tell them is that everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. So I'm not telling you to skip any of these questions. I'm telling you to consider how you work and then think about how to prioritize questions on that basis. And so that includes things like skipping parallel questions automatically rather than doing them, skipping question types that you struggle with automatically. Although I think usually questions 1 through 10, you should attempt all of them and not automatically skip them, because usually those ones are more straightforward. Although sometimes they can put a landmine in there too. Other things that I tell students maybe to consider skipping, possibly skip on subject matter or language difficulty. Some questions are just brutal to understand what it is you're reading. And it's trivially true that the LSAT is not a test of subject matter, but you have to be able to understand the subject matter in order to understand the structure. And so if there's a particular topic you don't like, you might just skip and come back to that question. You should always flag questions. You should select an answer because there's no guessing penalty on the LSAT. You should never leave anything blank. But you should, I think, skip those questions and come back to them. Also, I very often tell my students, just skip questions 18 through 22 and come back to them. Because once again, that's usually where they put the really hard stuff. So that's mostly my advice with logical reasoning. I'll tell you about the system that I instituted, because I instituted it specifically for logical reasoning, but it was what you were talking about, throwing good time after bad. I was doing that a lot. I was spending 4 or 5 minutes on a question because I was arrogant and saying to myself, well, I know I can answer this question. I just haven't figured it out yet. And so what I would do is spend a bunch of time on that question, not get to later questions, and probably get that question wrong anyway. And so I developed a system for myself that forced me to move through questions without looking at the clock. And the basic idea behind it was that I would give myself 2 passes at the stimulus and 2 passes at the answer choices. And if I could not find the answer choice by the end of that second pass at the answers, I had to move on. And when I instituted that system, I think my practice exam score went up 9 points right away. And I think the reason for that was, or there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that I was actually getting to the questions that I wasn't getting to before. But I also found that sometimes when I would skip a question and come back to it, I was not struggling with it because it was hard. I was struggling with it because I'd made a reading error. And I would continue to make that same reading error if I was reading the question over and over again. But when you move on and come back, you basically clear your cache and you look at it with a fresh set of eyes. And a lot of times a question I thought was difficult was actually not as difficult as I thought it was. I don't want to take up the whole show, so we can get to my logic games and my reading comp advice in a moment. But do you have any other tips and tricks for logical reasoning timing specifically?
Yeah. So on LR, I really like what you said about taking 2 passes, and I actually will teach my students to take 2 very specific passes. So first priority is to take a pass where you have anticipated what the right answer will be, and you are looking for the correct answer as you have anticipated. Now, if you don't find it on the first pass, I ask people to try doing a second pass where what you're looking for is the trap answer. Because most often, one of the most frequent problems that I run into with my students is that they get down to 2 and they don't know which one is correct. And that's because they've found the correct answer and they've found, as you put it, the landmine. So if you take your second pass and you make that your opportunity to look in a targeted way for the landmine, then you kind of switch your brain into a mode where you remember that you know what kind of traps the LSAT likes to throw at you. Because if you are already close to taking your actual official LSAT, you've done a lot of questions. You've seen all of the trap types. You've seen, the ones where, say, you're doing a flaw question and they give you an answer that accurately describes a flaw, but it just doesn't happen to be the precise flaw that's contained in the stimulus. Or it accurately describes a weak part of the argument, but it doesn't actually happen to be a flaw sufficient to render the conclusion significantly less substantiated and needing to be re-argued. So if you look first for the correct answer, then look for the trap answer, and then you still don't have anything, at that point it is quite reasonable to move on. I do actually also want to give a little bit of a nod, since we're talking overall about time management on LR, there's a second type of student. I'd say the vast majority, 90% plus of students, their struggle with time management on LR is that they run out of time. But some students, especially those that have kind of a lot of nervous adrenaline and go very, very quickly, some students actually, the problem they're having is that they're finishing all of the questions, no problem about that, but they are rushing so much that they are getting a high degree of inaccuracy. And then they're ending up with like 6 or 7 minutes at the end of the section that they don't know how to use it because they've rushed through all of the questions and they don't know which ones they probably got wrong by rushing. You know, maybe they go start at the beginning and try to review, but then they're going to review the first 10 questions, which are the ones that they're most likely to get right. So if you're in the I would say 6 to 10% of students who rush so effectively that you do actually end up with time to spare, but with low accuracy, the first thing that I would have you do is do some full sections without timing yourself, and in fact, take all clocks and time measuring devices away, even if you literally have to put a sticky note on your computer or on whatever device you're using the LSATMax app on to cover up the timer. Get rid of timing, clocks, everything completely, and take some full sections where you take deep breaths as you go through and you learn to actually use your full 35 minutes. In fact, try to go over on a few untimed sections and just solely focus on accuracy. So I'll have people do that for a little while, and then when they're ready to attempt a timed section again, before doing that, we'll talk about how to use any extra time effectively. Because you don't want to just use any extra time to go back and review your answers from the beginning. You want to actually learn to take note of when you're struggling with a question. So a good way is, just like you said, to notice when you take more than 1 or 2 passes through the answer choices, especially when you take more than 2 passes through the answer choices. That is probably a question you struggled with, and that's one that you might want to check. But avoid checking questions where you didn't have any clue as you were answering it initially that you were getting it wrong. Because if you go back and check everything, including questions that you answered easily the first time through, especially if you're a high anxiety person, you are more likely than not going to change a correct answer to an incorrect answer. So there's nothing worse than getting your score back, whether it's an official LSAT or a practice test, and realizing you gave away a point not by just getting the question wrong, but by getting it right and then going back and correcting yourself to the wrong answer. So go back and check your work only in cases where you had a reason at the time you originally solved the question to believe that you might be either guessing or choosing a wrong answer. Otherwise, if you do end up with extra time at the end and there are not flagged questions left to review, just use that time to gently shut your eyes or raise your eyes from your test and take a few deep breaths, because that's going to benefit you more than obsessing over the questions you've answered. Let's take a quick break.
I'm George W. Bush, and I approve this message. In fact, I think it is awesome.
So, remember when your mom's favorite reason for everything was, because I said so? Well, little did mom know, or maybe she did if your mom happened to be a lawyer, that she was committing one of the oldest fallacies in the book. But which one?
The ability to quickly identify the type of logical flaw in your opponent's argument is crucial, whether you're bickering with mom, conquering the LSAT, or ultimately changing the world. Our new prep book, 33 Common LSAT Flaws, will help you quickly identify different types of flawed reasoning and tear it apart.
Think of all the fallacious reasoning you hear on any given day.
What do you say to Americans who are watching you right now who are scared?
I say that you're a terrible reporter. That's what I say.
So I shouldn't be scared or worried about any of the super scary things going on because that guy is a terrible reporter? You know intuitively that the argument is bogus, but the LSAT will ask you questions that test your ability to point out why it's bogus.
At the end of the day, you can't afford to let the bad guys, the LSAT, or your mom win an argument. Grab your copy of 33 Common LSAT Flaws today to master the skills essential to the LSAT, the actual practice of law, and life.
Now available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback.
Now, back to the show. All right, so do you want to talk RC. I know you are one of the few LSAT instructors who considers RC as a specialty, Brandon.
Well, specialty, I guess you could call it a specialty. As much as I consider it a specialty, I unfortunately have by far the least advice for managing your time on reading comprehension, because I think that, and I think you were making this point about the LSAT in general, but I think this is specifically true about reading comprehension. They give you more than is basically possible to do. And I think what they're testing your ability to do, obviously in the narrow sense, the subject matter is testing your ability to do the work of law school. But in the broad sense, it's testing your ability to do the amount of work of law school, which is in law school, you're going to get assigned 200 pages of reading in one night, and you're going to come back and have 3 classes where you get grilled by the foremost experts on each of those topics, probably the one who wrote the book that you just read. And the question is, can you process a massive amount of information and answer questions intelligently about it in a short period of time? And like you were saying, I think for some people, there will just never be a 4-passage strategy that's a realistic strategy. That doesn't mean you can't get a very good score on the LSAT, but it does mean that you have to devote your attention to 3 passages and do it in an ordered and rational way rather than doing all 4 passages. That said, I do think there are certain things that you can do to manage your time well. So I'm about to break my rule about doing the easy stuff first, which is on reading comprehension. I think for a lot of people, it's actually best to do the hardest passage first. The reason for that is that reading comp, I think to a far greater extent than the other sections of the LSAT, is very mentally draining. And if you're doing the hard passage after having done 3 passages under time pressure, you might be hurting yourself, whereas doing the hard passage first and then doing the easier passages is actually going to be better for you. I do think there's a good pace to maintain. So usually, and again, this can change, usually the first 2 passages are more straightforward than the last 2 passages. And so you should expect that those will be the ones that you bank time on. And I think a good pace for reading comprehension is this. To finish all 4 passages, I think you should try to get through the first 2 passages in about 15 minutes. So that's about 7.5 minutes per passage in the first 2 passages, which leaves you 20 minutes for the last 2 passages. In that case, I think you can spend, 3 minutes tagging the passage and then another 4.5 minutes answering the questions. On the harder passages where you're taking 10 minutes, I think you can spend, 4 minutes tagging the passage, maybe even a little bit more, 5 or 6 minutes answering the questions. But you also have to make sure that as you are moving through the questions, you're not getting bogged down on any of the questions. And just like you were talking about with doing your work up front, I think being prepared for the questions is especially important in reading comprehension. So I think it's gotten a lot harder since it's not a paper and pencil exam anymore. Because when you could just tag the passage, then you could just make whatever marks you wanted to and whatever system worked for you. And then you could go back to the passage anytime you needed to as you're answering questions. Well, now you get 3 highlighter colors and the ability to underline. You get some scratch paper, but you cannot mark the passage. And so I think it's important and it's very helpful because I try to write as little as possible on my scratch paper as I'm doing a passage to use those highlighters and to use the underlining effectively. So I actually have a system, and you can come up with your own system, but my system for the highlighters is this. I use underline to underline conclusions. That's always the main point of the passage is a conclusion, usually the one the author adopts. I use yellow to highlight premises, supporting conclusions. I use pink to highlight attitude and criticisms, both positive attitude and negative attitude. And then I use the orange highlighter to mark important details. That includes things like comparisons. That includes things like definitions, stuff like that. And usually those are the kinds of details you get questions on. Also things that fall into categories. Very often you get questions on them. But I do think if you've highlighted a passage intelligently, hopefully you won't have to go to the passage that much to answer questions, but you'll be able to move back to your tags very quickly. But again, I think reading comp is just dastardly when it comes to time. So what about you? How do you think about reading comp timing?
Yeah, I mean, reading comp timing is a brutal, brutal beast. And I agree with you that if you can get the first two done in 15 minutes and bank that time for the later passages, that really is the key to being able to do the difficult passages with a high degree of accuracy. You really, really cannot be using 8 minutes and 45 seconds on the first two passages and then be expecting to get 4 passages done. If you really need that kind of time for the first 2 passages, which is, by the way, does not mean anything about your intelligence or your general ability or how good of a lawyer you're going to be. It just may mean that your reading speed is a little lower than some other students, which is something that's generally fairly fixed from childhood. The amount of reading you're going to do in law school may eventually increase it. But it is really, really tough to increase your reading speed as an adult without taking a lengthy speed reading course of study just for that. So, if that happens to be you, don't think that makes you a worse prospect for law school than anybody else, but you may want to plan to do 3 passages and guess on the 4th one, because 3 passages 100% correct is always going to end up giving you a better score than 4 rushed passages with a lot of questions wrong. So that being said, I do use my highlighters a little differently than Branden does, so feel free to pick and choose from our approaches if you want to. I like to identify, as I'm reading the passage, the perspectives that I'm dealing with. And if there are multiple perspectives, which is not always the case, there are plenty of RC passages where we only get the author's perspective, or we only get really kind of a neutral perspective that doesn't take sides on anything. But if we do have multiple perspectives presented, I like to use my highlighter colors to indicate when we're moving into different parties' arguments. So, for instance, in a passage where, let's say, we're comparing 2 groups of scientists' beliefs about why Europeans ate mummies. This is a real thing. I don't think it's ever been on the LSAT, but I was reading about it this morning, so I'm going to use it for my example. Europeans ate a lot of mummies, and that's why there are so few mummies preserved today. A lot of them were ground up and used in European corpse medicine. So you might have one group of scientists that are arguing it was because of religious tradition, and another group of scientists arguing that it evolved out of some sort of legitimate medical perspective about the substances used in mummy wrappings, and just sort of turned into a bizarre tradition where they ate the mummies themselves. So I would use 2 different highlighter colors to highlight those arguments, and like Branden, I would use the underlining tool to underline conclusions. So I pay special attention to the perspectives, because when there are multiple perspectives, you are highly likely to get questions that ask about either one group's conclusion, so let's say the theologist's conclusion that the mummy eating was all a religious thing, or one group's attitude. So maybe the historians who are pointing out that there was some medical benefit at one point to eating the mummy wrappings, you might be asked about their attitude towards ancient European culture. So if you know what the perspectives are and where you move into them, you know where to look back to for that. Now, I will also use my scratch paper a little bit if I need to, so I might mark out particularly important sections that I want to remember to pay attention to. I might make a little note on my scratch paper as I'm going through if I see something that I'm just sure I'm going to be asked about, like, say, a study. I might just write down paragraph 3, study, because studies almost always show up in the questions. So, there's no one absolutely right way to use these tools. I agree with Branden that reading comp has gotten harder, much, much harder now that it is on a screen rather than paper. Experiment with things, see what works for you. But the one thing you don't want to do, and I think we can both agree on this, is you absolutely do not want to go into a reading comp section without a consistent plan and strategy for how you're going to use those highlighters and underlining tools. You need to know before you go in, because if you change it around passage by passage or test by test that you take, then you're going to get to the point where you are mentally exhausted from doing reading comp, and you forget if you were highlighting differing perspectives or highlighting conclusions or highlighting important details or premises, and you get the questions wrong just because you forgot your own system. So have a consistent system and use it. Having a system really is my system.
Indeed, you've got to have a battle plan or else you are just cannon fodder, and nobody wants to be that. So let's wrap it up by talking about games timing. I do think that there is a whole lot that you can do to manage your time on games. And here is my kind of overarching theory of the case. And I think you hit on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about timing, but it's all about, well, it's not all about, but it is a lot about doing the work up front. Students tend to think that the points live in the questions, and I don't think they do. I think the points live in your preparation for the questions. And so spending a few minutes on your setup, considering scenarios, and I happen to think that lots and lots of games are scenarios games. I do scenarios on maybe half of games that I do, something like that. Even if you're spending a significant amount of time on those, sometimes what you will find is that it just breaks the game open. And so what I try to encourage my students to do is because you can't turn off the anxiety about getting to the questions. I don't think that's possible. But you can shift the focus of your anxiety. And so people have anxiety about wanting to get to the questions quickly. And what I say is that you should have anxiety about wanting to get to the questions prepared for them. And so my anxiety is about being prepared before I get to the questions. Like I said, that has a lot to do with scenarios, but it also has to do with building your setup right. But there are a lot of other things that you can do to manage your time on games. For instance, or at least probably the most important as you are doing questions, I think, is to use your prior work. So, and most people I think have heard of this. If you do a conditional question, one of those if questions, and you create a setup for it, well, you can use that setup on other questions, sometimes to find the right answer, although that's unlikely, but very, very commonly to be able to eliminate wrong answers. And so I tend to, especially on games that I haven't done scenarios on, I tend to do those if questions first, because very often you can take what you've learned and apply it to another question. And to be clear, it works like this. So if you build a hypothetical correctly, you have found something that could be true of the game. That will allow you on another must be false question to eliminate answer choices. So if, for instance, you're doing a sequencing game, and you figure out in one of your hypotheticals that C can go third, C can finish the race third, and there's another question somewhere that says which one of the following must be false, and one of the answer choices says C goes third, well, that's the wrong answer. You've seen it happen, and so you can get rid of that answer. You can also, although this is a little bit harder, get rid of wrong answers to must be true questions when something didn't happen in a hypothetical. Because if something doesn't happen in a hypothetical, it could be false. So again, we saw C in 3 in my example. And if they say which one of the following must be true, and an answer choice says D finishes third, well, that doesn't have to be true. We've seen C finish third. And I really think that the makers of the LSAT are actually thinking about this, because there are times when one of those open-ended questions, which one of the following must be true, is very difficult. But if you've gone on and done a later question and come back to it, you'll actually have a lot of ammunition to knock out wrong answers. So that is my, I think, best advice about managing your time. I do think we can talk about pacing. I think my pacing advice is very much like pacing for reading comp. But I know that you are the games maven much more than I am, Jelena. So let's save the best advice for last, which is yours.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I love games. I'm a games advocate. I do games for fun. And really what I've learned from going from somebody who did not know how to do games at all on my first practice test and bombed the entire section to someone who does games voluntarily as a hobby is that the games want to be solved. And no, I mean, I don't believe this is a Harry Potter situation where the test actually has a brain and the capacity to enjoy things. But I do believe that the people who make these games are puzzle lovers like myself. And puzzle lovers want you to solve their puzzles. People who do crossword puzzles, the constructors of those puzzles want their crosswords to be solved. They want them to be difficult, but they want to hear from people who solved them. So the logic games, they are constructed by highly intelligent people, often PhDs in philosophy, which, by the way, a PhD program in philosophy is one of the few things other than the LSAT that includes something very much like logic games as part of the curriculum. And they're puzzle lovers. They want you to solve their puzzles. So what happens is you have 4 games that really their objective as a entity is to challenge you, but not to challenge you beyond the limits of your capacity to solve. So if you allow them to help you, they will. One of the ways that they help you is that they give you clues for when to do scenarios. So we can talk more about scenarios on another podcast, and we've talked a little bit about the importance of scenarios previously. But really good scenario cues are rules or options that split the game into 2, 3, or at most 4 possibilities. I never do more than 4 scenarios. That's just, I choose that because 4 is the number of incorrect answers that you could potentially have to do a hypothetical for in order to find the one correct answer. So if I'm going to be doing more than that just to do scenarios, I'm not going to do scenarios. I'm just going to go ahead and do the hypos that I have to do. That being said, I love to do scenarios because that is the first way that the game helps you solve it, is by offering you scenario options. Scenarios lead you to more deductions, and they may actually lead you to things that are absolutely true. Like, say, if M has to be in 6 in both scenarios, then you can go ahead and put M in 6 if you are sure that you've done all the possible scenarios, all the possible applications of the rule. Then M goes in 6 on your master diagram, and there might be a must-be-true question that has M in 6 as the right answer. The second thing that logic games do to help you solve them is many of them give you an elimination question. Doesn't always happen, and some of the more difficult and some of the easiest games don't have it. You know, they sometimes don't give it to you if the game is so easy you don't need it, and sometimes they don't give it to you if they want to challenge you more, or if the setup is so complex that doing an elimination question would really just take up an unreasonable amount of time. But the elimination question gives you a free hypo. It gives you a possible scenario in which the game is fully filled out and it works. So you're going to want to take that free hypo, either write it out, or if you're somebody who doesn't need to rediagram it out from the answer choice, you can just circle that answer choice and refer back to it. But that is a way that you can test some of the things that you've deduced. If your free hypo from the elimination question conflicts with one of your deductions, then go back, your deduction is wrong. Then another way that the tests like to help you is through certain of the questions, as Branden touched on. For instance, if you have an absolute could be true, in other words, there's no conditional element to it, it just says which one of the following could be true, then you know that you've got 4 wrong answers that are absolute must be false. So if you've done your setup and your scenarios perfectly, then you probably have restrictions or not laws for 4 wrong answers there, things that must be false that are already diagrammed out as false. But most of us don't do our setup perfectly every time. So if you haven't done your setup perfectly, then those absolute could be true or could be false questions are a great opportunity to get some free deductions from the wrong answers. Because if you can prove that one thing is the correct could be true, then you've proved that all 4 of the incorrect answers are must be false. You can represent them back on your master diagram. And likewise, if you've proved that one thing could be false, then the 4 incorrect answers are must be true, and you can represent those on your diagram. And then the last way that the LSAT helps you solve logic games, the logic games want to be solved, is that they are, I do believe, I agree with Branden here, they are intentionally constructed so that you can use whatever hypotheticals or conditionals that you do while solving the questions in solving the subsequent questions. So my aim with every single logic game, my ideal, is that I do my setup so perfectly that the only time my pencil moves going through the questions is to mark off incorrect answer choices and to circle, I guess I shouldn't be saying pencil, the only time my mouse moves now that we're digital, or my stylus. But the only drawing that I'm doing as I'm going through my answer choices and my questions is to mark the correct and incorrect answer choices. I would love to just go through all of the questions without doing any more diagramming. Not always possible. Sometimes there's conditionals that you absolutely have to diagram. But then my second choice is that I get through as many of the questions as possible with no additional diagramming after my setup. But then I'm able to use the conditional on one question to answer at least 2 questions. And that's almost always possible because they write it with that in mind. The logic games really, they're not just a test of your solving ability. They are, like the LSAT overall, they are a test of your strategic and perceptive ability. They want to know if you can perceive when there is help available. And the game itself is often that help that is available. Use your free hypo, use your conditionals from your past questions, use your scenarios, use those could be true, could be false questions that give you free deductions from the answer choices. Use everything that is at your disposal, and you will be able to fly through the logic games section. And this is something, not everything on the LSAT can be taught. I cannot teach someone to speed up their reading speed. I don't know how. That's not something I'm qualified in. I don't know if anybody can teach that in a reasonable time frame for learning to study for the LSAT. But I believe that I can teach anybody to be pretty darn good at logic games. They are very learnable. So it starts with not being scared of them, learning to enjoy them, and learning to believe that there are elements in the logic games themselves that, rather than being there to hurt you, are there to help you. And that's kind of my diatribe on manage your time well on logic games by accepting the help that they are willing to offer you.
Well, that was an excellent diatribe, and I think it's not just good advice for logic games, but it is good advice for life. Don't do everything on your own. Allow people to help you, just like we're helping you right now study for the LSAT. But I think that is all the time we have for time today, Jelena.
So before we go, should we leave our listeners with a final LSAT thought of the week?
Yeah, let's do it. So here's what I think. The August LSAT, this is the one coming up very, very soon, is the last one before application season opens at most schools in October. And a lot of people are desperate to have their applications wrapped up in a neat bow for the admissions committee on day one. Well, desperation doesn't make for great decision making. It is true that law schools do rolling admissions, meaning they start giving away seats early on. And so you're competing for fewer seats if your application shows up later in the process. But that said, schools reserve lots of seats until the end of application season. They don't want to lose the fantastic applicants that are going to come later in the process. And that, the end of admission season, is usually February or even later for some schools. And I think it is much, much better to come in with a high LSAT score later on than to apply early with a lower score. So yes, take the August LSAT, even if you're not testing at your target score, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the final time that you take the LSAT. So just make sure that you come in to the application season with the score that is going to wow them, even if that's a little bit later.
Totally agree with that. You know, you want to be the best candidate that you can be, and they want you to be the best candidate that you can be so that you improve their stats. So win-win. My final thought is a little different. It's not literally LSAT related, but kind of related to this broader situation that we are in the world right now, where we're spending a whole lot of time at home. So my final thought for the week is, please take care of your physical body while you are studying. Maybe it is because I just had a birthday, despite my best efforts to put aging off until after the pandemic. But lately I've been thinking about how, now that we're all stuck at home most of the time, we're studying and working in spaces that might not have originally been designed for daily multiple hour use. So if you're feeling new back, neck, or wrist pain while studying, please don't just push through it. You're going to give yourself an injury that you have to deal with for years. Instead, take a moment to audit your study setup and consider replacing old chairs or keyboards with more ergonomic versions. Maybe get some expert advice on it if you need to. I've recently been using an improvised standing desk. It's actually my record player on top of my record stand, which is super hipster of me, but it happens to be at just the right height to be a standing desk for me. And sitting less is making my body feel way happier about being in a work from home position where I don't have fancy corporate budget paid for ergonomic desks and chairs and keyboards. So something as simple as just spending half the day standing rather than sitting can put off the stage of your life where your body hurts you all the time by years.
And that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate all of your ratings and reviews over the past couple of weeks, too. Great reviews really help us climb the podcast charts so more LSAT learners can enjoy the show.
You can find all our past episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also send us a question at, again, podcast@testmaxprep.com, or record a short voice message at 310-893-6303.
And you can also check out the show notes for links to further reading and resources from today's episode.
Until next time, stay hydrated, study hard, and remember,
Plenty of heroes carry a briefcase.